Game day on Gamecock Central Radio. Welcome in, everybody. Emerson Phillips with Wes Mitchell. Looking forward to South Carolina and Akron. A strange situation here, Wes, with the Gamecocks playing a very rare home game in the month of December. Granted, December 1st, but makeup game for Hurricane Florence back in September. And South Carolina's got the Akron Zips for the first time in the history of the program.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a weird feel, I think, around town, around campus this week. It's been a long time since South Carolina has really played any type of post-Clemson regular season game, and actually been a really long time since South Carolina has played a December football game in the regular season as well. So a little bit of a strange deal. I don't think you're going to have your typical South Carolina crowd there at Williams-Brice Stadium, although they've made efforts to get as many people in the stands as possible. But I was reading today, it's actually the first time since 1990 that it's been a final regular season game against a team not named Clemson, and the first time since December 1987 that they've had a regular season game in the month of December. So a little bit of a weird feel, certainly, but I was making some notes to myself about the game, and I said, really, for South Carolina, there's three things that I think today's game is all about, Emerson. I think, first of all, is just take care of business, business-like attitude. Don't let Akron sort of hang around at the beginning. Put them away and put yourself in a position to get the seventh win. I think at the end of the day, you reschedule this game to add a seventh win. The second thing is to get the seniors one last opportunity to play at Williams-Brice Stadium. That's still something, regardless of it being a weird game, a smaller crowd, that's something those guys are going to covet and cherish. And then the final thing, to me, would be to get the young players as many reps as possible against a college opponent. We saw that against UT Chattanooga, and I think for South Carolina, you want to see that again against the Akron Zips.
So the Gamecocks are 6-5 coming into today's game. Noon kickoff at Williams-Brice. Akron is 4-7. West, they're in the MAC. That's a Group of 5 conference, and Akron was 4-3 earlier this year, but they've dropped their last 4 ball games against Northern Illinois, Eastern Michigan, Bowling Green, and Ohio, all conference opponents. They finished 4th in the MAC East Division. So Akron's kind of limping into this ball game, and I'm curious to see how much excitement, how much enthusiasm the Gamecocks bring coming off, obviously, what is a very emotional game against Clemson, not used to being in this situation. So what do the two teams have today, Wes?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the things you're going to probably want to pay attention to the most. Like I said, probably a less enthusiastic crowd as well, although I think part of that is that even if it's a smaller crowd, I think the ones who are there are probably going to be your fans that really, truly want to be there. So maybe, maybe from a volume standpoint as far as how loud it is, maybe it won't make a huge difference. But I think certainly early on, coming off the loss last week, playing a sort of lesser opponent, supposed to rain potentially as well. How much juice does South Carolina have? I think is a big question for this. But like you said as well, how much juice does Akron have? Is this a lot of times you'll get one of these opponents that's not an FBS school, or I should say not a Power 5 school. It's kind of their Super Bowl, but I don't know if you necessarily have that this week with Akron. But we'll see. They've got some playmakers. They've got an offense that's really not been that great this year, but they do have a dual threat quarterback who's put up some pretty good numbers. That I think at times has been pretty good this year. Cato Nelson, and you've got a defense that actually, if you look at the numbers, is sort of middle of the pack. They've given up 27 points per game, right under 390 yards per game, which actually, this day and age, as good as the offenses are, those numbers are actually decidedly like middle of the pack in the country. I think that points per game allowed is right at like 60th or in that neighborhood in the country. So not a terrible Akron defense, but it's not been a very good Akron offense, just 20.4 points per game scored this year.
Concerns about the size of the crowd, like you mentioned, West, with this game not originally being on the Gamecock schedule. Ray Tanner and the South Carolina Athletic Department, middle part of this week, made some tickets available for free, upper deck seats, free to community groups and military in an effort to kind of make the crowd bigger for all these players playing on Saturday, and particularly for the seniors who are playing their final home game.
Yeah, and I think, the smart move by USC. I know those tickets ended up sort of being available to everybody, but I think their heart was in the right place, and it was a smart move in the first place to try and do that, because you do want to reward those members of the community by getting them into the football game, and I think an opportunity for them and their families to get there. And like you said, this is about those seniors who are never – you look at the game of football, not to get too deep on everybody, but when it's over, it's over. It's not like
That's
basketball
right.
where you can pick up a basketball and go play with your friends. It's not like baseball where you can go play in an old man softball league like I do. It's really when the days are over for football, there's really no way to simulate it, I think. So just one more opportunity for these guys to get out there and do what they love is pretty important for all those kids, I think. And then, the other side is the kids who don't really get to play a whole lot, whether it be, we saw Jason Sin, who is on one end of the spectrum as a senior. He hadn't played his entire career, and he played almost the entire game against UT Chattanooga. And then you've got these young guys who are just starting their careers, the Carrion Joyner, Deshaun Fenwick at running back, all these defensive guys that have just been thrown into the fire as well. It's really an opportunity for them to go. How many times since Will Muschamp has arrived have we heard him say the words, it's a developmental game? Well, this is a developmental game on Saturday because South Carolina is going to have a chance, I'm sure they hope at least, to get a bunch of their young guys in the game.
Wes, I was very grateful that the athletic department put out an email on Friday of this week explaining what is a zip. Do you know what a zip is? Did you know before the email came out yesterday?
I can honestly say that I had no idea.
Neither did I, brother. And the athletic department put out this email.
What is a zip, by the way?
The headline, the subject line of the email is, what is a zip? So the Akron Zips are in town for the noon kickoff today, and the athletic department was thoughtful enough to send out the email explaining what is a zip. In 1926, the athletic teams at Akron University were named the Zippers after rubber boots manufactured by the B.F. Goodrich Company, which was headquartered in Akron at the time. And then in 1950, the name was shortened to Zips. So they were the Zippers in 26, and in 1950 they shortened it to the Zips. So that's where it came from. Interesting factoid, interesting note on today's game. I don't think anybody in this part of the country knew exactly what a zip was, but now the mystery is solved. So Akron's in town for this noon kickoff. And Wes, you talked about young players getting action in the game today, and Gamecock Central sends out an email every week. Take 5 is the subject line, and some interesting content, some interesting news in the email that the website put out this week. And Deshaun Fenwick among the young players to watch this week, along with A.J. Turner, who has moved to defense this week. That was a very interesting development during Tuesday's midweek press conference for Will Muschamp. So plenty to keep an eye on today, even though this game doesn't really jump out at you from a huge name standpoint, and obviously no national rankings or anything like that, but a chance to get to 7 wins, and perhaps more importantly, Wes, a chance for the Gamecocks to play a lot of kids that have not seen a lot of time this year.
Yeah, I really thought, Emerson, that Fenwick showed some signs against Chattanooga of potentially being a really good football player. And, that's a position where South Carolina has been pretty solid, but haven't necessarily had consistent game breakers. And I think that's the next step for this offense, is to have a consistent performer at running back. So getting Fenwick in there, letting him play a bunch a couple of weeks ago, maybe you have that opportunity to do that again this week, I think would be a big thing for that offense and the future of it. And then, this A.J. Turner development, I know we talked about it a bit earlier in the week, but I'm actually curious to see, A, how much does A.J. Turner actually go play, and B, how does he go play? I think you look at a kid like him, you look at the way he runs on offense, you look at his physicality on that side of the ball, you look at his physicality and ability to play in space on special teams. I'm not counting him out. I think he actually could go possibly excel on that side of the ball. So, it's a little bit of a makeshift move for right now, but I also think it's a potential experiment for the future.
Rosendo Lewis is on the list of players to watch for the Gamecocks this week as well. Wes played against Clemson, but he only practiced at Sam linebacker for 1 week, and that was the position he played against the Tigers last Saturday. So with all the injuries on the defensive line, Rosendo Lewis, freshman from South Florida, will be there playing on the D-line this week, and he'll be one of the keys to stopping the run. Wes, I loved his film. His high school film was really good. This guy was a wrecking ball in high school, and I was very excited when he signed with the Gamecocks last year.
Yeah, they've moved him around. He did, rewatching that game against Clemson, he played a bunch at linebacker last week. Once Daniel Fennell went out, and actually practiced last week a bit at the buck spot, which is sort of the defensive end linebacker spot. And I think that's where they'll have him this week, because Brad Johnson, he played over 90 snaps last week, which is just pretty much unheard of for that buck spot. You almost can't do that, I think. So they'll need to have more guys that they can rotate in there. Luckily, that Sam spot and that buck spot are kind of tied together. They're very similar positions. A lot of the stuff they do in practice, they're linked together as far as the way they teach the concepts. So he has had to move around quite a bit, especially for a young player. But I think that's a good spot for him, man. And I'm not going to be surprised if long term he spends a lot of time at that Sam backer and buck position there on the line. And this is another week for him and Ernest Jones, someone who I think you saw some good things from against UT Chattanooga, got a bunch of playing time against Clemson. Those are two young guys that are going to have a future in the linebacking position, and that need to sort of take advantage of these opportunities that they've had the last few weeks.
So, Wes, some other key players for the Gamecocks this week. Brad Johnson out of Pendleton, a defensive end who played significant snaps. He was on the field virtually the entire game against Clemson for that Gamecock defense that got gashed, gave up a school record 700-plus yards. And I wanted to get you to talk about Brad Johnson a little bit.
Yeah, and like you said, had to play so many snaps against Clemson. You never want for a guy who's lining up at a position near the line of scrimmage to have to do that. And I think that's part of the reason you're going to see more Rosendo Lewis there this week. But Brad hung in there. I think he's still a little bit undersized for that spot. He's more of a pass rush guy as opposed to a run stopper, but he's had to sort of adjust and play a bunch, not just against Clemson, but the last couple of weeks because of the injuries at that position. I mean, you're really talking about a spot where, I mentioned Daniel Fennell, but Bryson Allen Williams has been at that spot when he was healthy. DJ Wanham has been at the buck spot and the defensive end spot when he was healthy. So really, South Carolina's depth has just been eaten away at that position. So that's led to Brad having to play a lot more than he maybe would have otherwise.
Wes, Jake Bentley's kind of been the talk of the town here last few days after his school record performance against Clemson, 510 yards passing and 5 TDs in that loss to the Tigers last Saturday. Wes, we did the Game Day podcast last Saturday, and I had come across in the game notes South Carolina's school record for passing yards against Clemson, and it was held by Tommy Suggs. I think the year was 1970, and the most yards the Gamecocks had ever thrown for against Clemson, at least a single player had thrown for, was 316 yards. And I remember thinking that was not a huge number, particularly in today's game. Uh-huh. And Bentley went out and threw for almost 200 more than that. 510 was the total against Clemson last Saturday. And he gashed a Tiger defense that really had not been scorched that way all year, not even close to it, in fact. And so this week we have reports coming out. The state newspaper ran an article this week about Bentley possibly going pro at the end of this year. And the state paper referenced Todd McShay, who is one of ESPN's NFL draft experts, along with Mel Kiper Jr. And McShay was at the Carolina-Clemson game, and after the game he said that Bentley would have a day 2 draft grade, which means he would go no sooner than the second round if he's drafted this year. And McShay went on to say that he thinks Bentley can be a good NFL quarterback. He thinks he could be a starter, but certainly a backup if he doesn't get the opportunity to be a starter. But he also said that Bentley would probably be best served returning for another year. So I know this is looking ahead a little bit, but this will be a major story as we move into the offseason, what Jake Bentley plans to do.
Yeah, it will be. And, Jake sort of he was asked about, does he think about that right now, and he really sort of deferred away from it, as you would expect. But I think when, with what he also added to that was that there's still a lot that he wants to accomplish at South Carolina, both personally and from a team standpoint. He sounded to me like a guy that just reading the tea leaves is, very, very excited about the opportunity for what this team could be and could do next year. But, he is a quarterback. He's a sharp kid. He's going to, as almost all college football players in that position probably should do, he's going to look at his opportunities and see what's out there and then go from there. So I tend to just, like I said, reading the tea leaves, I think Jake Bentley's back in a South Carolina uniform next year and probably going after a number of all-time career records as far as South Carolina quarterbacks go.
Mm-hmm.
But again, you owe it to yourself. If you're a college football player in that position, you owe it to yourself just to see where you stand. Where do they project you and stuff like that. But I do think another year would probably benefit Jake Bentley quite a bit.
When Bentley first came to South Carolina, there was a lot of people that felt like, he was a 3-year player and then he would go pro. There were a lot of people that seemed to think Bentley would go pro after 3 years. That talk subsided during his second and most of his third year at South Carolina, but he's played so daggum good, West, the last 4 or 5 games, and particularly with that 500-yard effort against Clemson and the 5 touchdown passes and just the way he competed from start to finish in that game, that really we've started to hear this talk again this week for the first time. So I thought that was interesting, and it'll be interesting to see what Jake Bentley does. Obviously, best-case scenario for South Carolina football is that he come back for another year, because the Gamecocks, if Bentley comes back next year, you got to feel like the Gamecocks are in good shape if they can find some answers on defense next year.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the reason you're hearing that talk now is obviously the last 4 or 5 games he's been really, really good, but doing it at Clemson in Death Valley, and probably I think if the Florida game had not ended the way it did, that's something a lot of people would be talking about as well, is the fact that, and I personally think he played actually really well in Gainesville. So, there was this sort of, narrative going around about Jake Bentley against these top 25 opponents and the record there and the numbers. And, a lot of people talked about the Clemson games from the past, how Jake Bentley's, I think his 2 worst games statistically previously were his 2 games against Clemson before this past week, obviously. So that was a popular narrative, which I think, a lot of that is a bit unfair, because if you just look at what he was up against in some of those games, especially early in his career, I don't know if any quarterback could have, had big days. But now showing that he can do it against top opponents, showing that he can do it on the road as well, is going to be big for Jake Bentley to sort of squash that. And, next year you look at this schedule, and there's an opportunity for Jake Bentley to really, I think, play his way up the draft boards. You're talking about, obviously, Clemson again. You're talking about a trip to Athens. You're talking about Alabama coming to Columbia. The opener there in an NFL stadium, Bank of America. And really an opportunity, I think, for Jake Bentley coming back. And also, like I said, he's probably, and I don't have the records in front of me, but I got to imagine he's going to be closing in on some career passing records at South Carolina, climbing that leaderboard. And if he could build off of what he has done the final 4 or 5 games of this season and carry it into next year, obviously you lose Deebo Samuel, but, I know they hope to get Brian Edwards back. They'll have their running backs back. Josh Vann, I think, will take a step forward. Shi Smith will be a junior. The offensive line will lose a couple of guys, but you look at the young guys on the offensive line as well, there's really an opportunity for this offense to be good again.
South Carolina and Akron today with Wes Mitchell. I'm Emerson Phillips here on the Gamecock Central Game Day podcast. 17 touchdown passes and only 4 interceptions for Jake Bentley in the last 5 ball games, so he's really picked up his level of play. And the Gamecocks have played some pretty good football coming down the stretch here. South Carolina 6-5, looking for its 7th win of the season. Wes, we talked earlier this week here on GCR about how a 7th win could improve the Gamecocks' bowl bid. So we're going to find out tomorrow exactly where the Gamecocks will go bowling. It figures to be well, we don't know. It could be the Belk Bowl. That's kind of been the leading candidate, I think, the last week or so. But the Gator Bowl is still very much in the mix as well. And I know Gamecock fans would enjoy a trip to the Gator Bowl down in Jacksonville. And a 7th win is obviously going to be needed, Wes, to get that Gator Bowl bid. So where do we stand to the best of your knowledge, here 24 hours before the start of bowl season?
Yeah, it's been interesting to track. And I think first I have to say that it is very hard because it's not like it used to be as far as the selection process goes. For that section of bowls, or that tier of bowls, I guess is the best way to say it, the SEC is basically slotting who goes where. So the school can say, hey, we'd love to go to, this bowl. The Gator Bowl can say, we would love to have South Carolina, but the conference ultimately is going to slot who goes where. And, my reporting has sort of been a bit back and forth this week on it because it's sort of jockeyed back and forth behind the scenes. The Gator Bowl has been really strong on South Carolina. They've wanted South Carolina for 2 years now, and they've really been, they haven't hidden that fact. They've been pretty open about it. At one point, it looked like Texas A&M may be headed to the Outback Bowl, and then South Carolina would probably have then been headed to the Gator Bowl. Full disclosure, as we're recording this on Friday afternoon, just in case something does change, I kind of think it started to settle down, honestly. I think it settled more towards South Carolina ended up at the Belk Bowl. And I still think that's a strong pull for the Gamecocks. They'd be against an ACC opponent. Lots of talk about Virginia possibly being the ACC pick in the Belk Bowl. Again, none of this stuff is completely concrete. Sunday afternoon is generally when it will sort of be made official. South Carolina has a press conference Sunday evening.
Yep.
Well, they'll talk about it. But, those are the two bowls. And part of the reason it's really played out that way has been because you look at the college football playoff, and you're talking about Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and LSU, 4 SEC teams that are going to be either among the actual playoff or of those New Year's Six college football playoff selection games. So those 4 teams sort of all being up there has helped to slide the SEC up one spot, really, for those teams from what they would have been otherwise. I think, reading the tea leaves, that Kentucky seems to be headed to the Citrus Bowl. I think right now, probably Mississippi State to the Outback Bowl, Texas A&M to the Gator Bowl, which then, of course, puts South Carolina in the Belk Bowl. Maybe Missouri in one of the Tennessee games, either Music City or Liberty.
Right.
And I don't know, maybe Auburn ends up at the Texas Bowl, potentially. But, yeah, Gator Bowl, I think, still in it for South Carolina. I know they really – their dream scenario, I think, was South Carolina against NC State. Now, the way the ACC does it is that the Camping World Bowl actually has first pick after, college football playoff and New Year's Six and all that stuff. So Camping World, and it's a true pick. It's not where the ACC slots them. And really the only 2 schools they could take, if you look at the records, assuming NC State beats East Carolina this week, would be Syracuse or NC State. And right now, I think if you're them, you probably take NC State, which would take NC State obviously off the board for the Gator Bowl. So maybe Miami ends up at the Gator Bowl. And again, I'm just sort of spitballing with some stuff I've heard. Nothing is concrete, but as far as those 2 games go, South Carolina's potential opponent, and Gator Bowl can actually take Big Ten or ACC. They're leaning heavily this year towards the ACC. South Carolina's opponent, if they were to end up there, dream scenario for Gator Bowl, NC State. More likely scenario, Miami, takes the short trip up to Jacksonville. And then, again, Virginia just seems to be talked about a lot for the Belk Bowl. Obviously, there's probably a couple of other ACC schools that would be in the running there as well.
All right, the Camping World Bowl is played in Orlando, organized by the same group that runs the Citrus Bowl. So that's what Wes was talking about there. And it looks like either the Gator or the Belk, Jacksonville or Charlotte, for the Gamecocks. I think a Gator Bowl trip would be fantastic. I think the fans would like that. But Charlotte might be actually a little bit better fit, Wes. Shorter trip. Certainly more Gamecock fans would make the trip to Charlotte than to Jacksonville. And it would probably be with, an ACC opponent, like you said, which the Gamecocks have some history with. So we'll see if it's Jacksonville or Charlotte for South Carolina. We'll find out tomorrow. All the bowl announcements and the college football playoff matchups announced tomorrow as well. So we're ready to go here, Wes. December game, home game for the Gamecocks here. We're typically seeing high school football at Williams-Brice this time of year.
Yeah.
But the hurricane back in September has forced a South Carolina home game. And we're lucky that it's not cold this week, Wes. I think, I don't know if Akron's going to have any fans down here. Maybe they got some fans stopping through to watch the game on their way to Hilton Head. But, pretty good weather for Carolina and Akron this week. That's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. And I think, again, I'll finish it off, Emerson, the way I started. 3 keys for South Carolina. Or not even keys, 3 goals for South Carolina. Get that 7th win, get the seniors one last chance out there, and 3, get those young guys as many reps as possible. So we'll see what happens today, and then we'll cover it all on Gamecock Central. And then, hey, shameless plug, man, the next, next 3 weeks is the lead in to the early signing period. So we're going to have complete coverage of all that on Gamecock Central, and that's really become basically the de facto true signing day, believe it or not. So it's right around the corner, and we'll have complete coverage of that.
All right, Wes, I've been to the RBC Heritage many times in Hilton Head, and every time I go to Hilton Head, there's more Ohio license plates on the cars down there than there are South Carolina tags. So that's why I bring up Hilton Head today. Good stuff today, Wes. Looking forward to talking more Gamecock football with you. We'll have the bowl announcement tomorrow and plenty more to come this month on Gamecock Central Radio. For Wes Mitchell, I'm Emerson Phillips. This is the Gamecock Central Game Day Podcast. Thanks for joining us, and enjoy the ball game, friends.